Have you ever felt intimidated at just the thought of using Photoshop? Well, fear no more, because today we are going to take the first step in overcoming that fear. I'm really excited to start this new series because Photoshop is something that I'm really passionate about, and I'm really more excited about the fact that I get to help you with getting started in Photoshop. And don't think of it as Photoshop is too much for me to learn or Photoshop is too complicated, but think of it in the sense that Photoshop is all the tools that you need. You have them right at your fingertips. Graphic designing doesn't have to be done in Photoshop, but I really believe that based on my experience, being able to say that, hey, I did it in Photoshop, or hey, I can do it in Photoshop, will really give you an edge or an advantage over your potential competition. Because let's say you were to hire a graphic designer, right? And you have a list of candidates to choose from, and you're reviewing their resumes and you're seeing where some have experience in Microsoft Word, Microsoft Publisher, Microsoft Paint, Canva, or some other kind of online platform, and you finally see that someone has skills in Photoshop. Who would you hire? I know I'd give the job to that person with Photoshop skills, no question. I don't want you to mistake what I'm saying. I'm not saying those other tools can't get the job done, but I'm just saying that Photoshop is the industry standard in graphic design. So before we get started, we are going to need a copy of Photoshop. I already have mine. I'll put a link in the description as to where you can get yours if you don't already have it. And it doesn't matter which version of Photoshop you're using. Everything that we're going to go through is pretty much general across the board. So now we're going to open Photoshop and get started. So this is our Photoshop interface. And as you can see, we have an option that says create new, open, and we have drag and drop an image, etc, etc. And what we want to do today is create a new template, and we can do that by clicking here or going file and then new. So let's go ahead and select new, and then we can choose the size for what we want to do. And the size for my YouTube thumbnail is 1920 pixels. We can also change this to inches if we'd want, but we're working with pixels today, so 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels high. That's our width and our height and our resolution. The industry standard is 300 dpi for your resolution, so we're not going to change this, and I usually don't change anything else. So how you can find out the size of what you want to create in Photoshop: first, you have to know what you're making. So if you were making a Facebook cover photo or a YouTube thumbnail like we're doing today, you would go to Google and you can type in YouTube thumbnail size, and you'll see that size, and you just come over and put that into Photoshop, and then we're just going to hit create. And here's our blank template or blank canvas. Now there's a few things that you're looking at here. In the top right hand corner is your swatches, and these are just color choices that you have. Below that is your document properties. We'll get to that later on in the video. And below that we have our layers. Now layers are your best friend. Think of it like a deck of cards. You have one card on top, another below that, etc, etc, right? So if you want something to be on top, all you have to do is just move it from wherever it is in the list of layers or in the deck of cards and just bring it up. And it's pretty straightforward, so it's not anything to worry about. On the left hand side of our window now we have our tools, and some of the most popular tools are lasso tool, the move tool. Obviously you'll use that to move stuff around. We have our crop tool, and you can see there's some little videos playing here to give you a sense of what they do. We have our eraser tool, brush tool, or text or type tool. We have our shape tool, and we have our zoom tool or magnifying glass. Obviously you know what that does. And then we have our foreground color and our background color here, and I could change these if I want by just clicking on them and then adjusting these color values to get a color that I want. Or I could go over to the swatches here on the right hand side and just pick a color like that, and you see it changes, and I would just select OK. So let's change the other color just because we're messing around today. Let's just choose one from this right here. Let's go this kind of green. Not too bad, right? And then in addition to the tools that you have on the right hand side, up top right here, when you select a tool, let's choose a type tool, you can see the cursor changes to a type cursor, and it gives you some default text, and the text automatically took the color of the foreground color that we have here. Let's change this by clicking, change that to something that you can see, and then you can change the type of font that we're using. This is the one that I'm going to be using today, but then you have some general fonts that comes with every computer, and you can select the weight of the font You know, you can change it to italics, you know, narrow, black, which is really thick. And you get the point. You can change the size. It's on 20 now, let's do 48. Well, you won't see all of it because it's bigger than the box that we have here. But you don't even have to create a box. Let's go ahead and delete this. If I were to just click in the window, you can see that it would have just brought up the text. So let's go ahead and change the size of this. And you see it's just getting bigger and bigger. If I were to enter something like 100, it's just getting bigger and bigger. Now let's undo that. And I undo that by going edit, undo, and you can see the shortcut here, Control and Z. Let's go ahead and click that, Control and Z, until I get it back to where I want it. There we go. So we have our tools on the left hand side and we have our tool options here that we just went over. Each tool on this side has options up here on top, right? Now let's delete this and let's get started in making our YouTube thumbnail for this video that we're doing today. So for this design, I have an image that I already took before I started to record this video that I'm just going to bring in. So I'm just going to go to where that image is, desktop, LSPV, and I'm going to drag the image onto my template. And you can see that once I brought the image in, it has a bounding box around it. And when I pull on the edges of this box, it makes my image larger or smaller. Now in some Photoshop versions, you have to hold the Shift key to maintain the aspect ratio of your image, meaning that when you stretch the image, it doesn't look weird. But on this version of Photoshop, I don't have to do that. But let me show you what I mean. On some older versions, if I'm not holding the Shift key, this is what will happen. You can see it will just crush my image unnaturally. And that's not what I want. So let's undo that, Control Z, and then let's stretch it to about 35%. I could also just come up here in my tool options and just enter 35, because you see it says width W and H, right? And because this is clicked right here, the aspect ratio, whatever I enter in width will automatically go over here in height. So let's press enter. And we've successfully placed our first image, or brought our first image into Photoshop. And I think I want to place it here because I already have an idea of what this thumbnail should look like. Okay, so now let's bring in, well, before I bring in anything else, the vision I had for this logo is when I was pointing, where I'm pointing, I want to put the Photoshop logo right here. And above that, I want to write something right here that says like learn Photoshop or something like that. So let's go ahead and bring in the Photoshop logo. We're gonna do the same thing. I know where I have it, same place where I have this image. I'm just going to bring that in, drag and drop. There it is, and I size it to how I want it. This should be fine. I'm gonna put it right here by my finger, maybe a little bit smaller. That should be good. And then I'm going to press enter, and we've placed that image. And then I'm going to type the words, learn Photoshop. Learn Photoshop. Oh, missed an O. Okay. And I'm going to change the text to white. Remember, tool options up top. Click the blue, and I'm changing the color of the text. I'm changing it to white. I'm also going to change the font style. The one that I want to use today is, before I start typing anything, you can just click this arrow, and then you have a host of font options to choose from. And the one I want to use today is League Spartan. I'm just going to just select that. And you can download fonts online. Some fonts are free online. And this I'm going to make a little bit bigger because, you know, thumbnails are really small on YouTube, and no matter how small it is, I want to ensure that it's readable. Maybe not that big. Let's drop the size down some more. And you see this space right here between the learn and the Photoshop? You can make that smaller by going over here to layers, and above layers where you have properties like we mentioned earlier, you can adjust this right here, the leading, and you see where it says auto, you can go ahead and change that. You can change that value. You can just click the drop down and select something That's too close. Let's bring it down some more. Still too close. Not so much. Let's adjust that. Good. Now what I want to do next is the Learn Photoshop is a bit hard to read because the text is white. The closet behind it is also white. So I want to put a shape behind it, maybe a rectangle. So let's go ahead and select the shape tool or the rectangle tool, or we can press U. And then the color that I will want inside of it is a blue that matches the blue in the Photoshop. Let's select maybe, well, we can change it later. So we're clicking and holding, and then we're drawing our rectangle by dragging the mouse. All right, let's go. Clicking, holding, and dragging the mouse. See that? That's where we want our rectangle. And you can see it came up in front of the Learn Photoshop, and that's not what we want. We want it to be behind it. So we're coming over to the layers on the right hand side, and you can see where you have rectangle 1. You can see where it's above Learn Photoshop. And remember, we were speaking about the deck of cards earlier. We're going to move rectangle 1 further down in the deck of layers, and you can see now it's behind Learn Photoshop. And that's what we want. Now the blue that's behind the Learn Photoshop is not exactly matching the blue that is in the Photoshop logo. So how I can change that is I can select the rectangle over here under layers, and I could just click this square in the bottom right hand corner. Just double click that, and it will give me a color picker. And then when I come over onto the Photoshop icon, you can see there's a little dropper right there. If I click that dropper, it will change my rectangle color to whatever color I picked. So if I pick the color of my monitor right here, it will change it to my monitor color. If I pick the color of this blue on my t-shirt, it will pick that color. If I pick the color up here of this red behind me, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you guys get the picture, right? Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is add a border to this rectangle, similar to the border that's on the Photoshop icon. Now in Photoshop, a border is not called a border, it's called a stroke. Now on my shape options, remember that's up top, my stroke right here says 1 pixel, right? However, there's no stroke indicated by this white box with the red line. So let's go ahead and click that, and we're going to select a blue that we think is closest to the Photoshop blue. Well, the light blue that's on the outside of the Photoshop icon. Let's select this one. I think that's close enough. And then let's make our border, let's say 15 pixels. Now let's make our rectangle a little bit bigger so it's not touching the word Learn Photoshop. And how I do that is on my keyboard, I press Control and then the letter T. And then you see that the bounding box came up outside of the rectangle. And I'm just going to drag this to wherever I want it. I want it maybe a little bit higher and wider. That should be good. And then I'm going to press enter because I'm finished. Well, the next thing I want to do is I want to align the Learn Photoshop and the rectangle so that they're aligned by their centers, the vertical and horizontal centers. So I'm going to select both of those layers. Remember, layers is over the right hand side. To select the Learn Photoshop and then hold the Control key on my keyboard and select the rectangle. And then with those both selected, you can see that my tool options up top changed. And now I have align horizontal centers and some other options here and align vertical centers, and that's what I want. Let's go ahead and hit both of them, vertical and horizontal, and there. Now you can see that they're perfectly aligned. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to group these so that wherever I move it, both the rectangle and the words Learn Photoshop move together. So what I can do now that I already have them selected, I can right click and click Group from Layers, or I can press Control on my keyboard and the letter G, that's a shortcut. And I could just name this group Learn Photoshop plus Rectangle. That way I know what's in the group. And then when I select that group, you can see what's inside of it by the drop down arrow. You close it there. And then when I move that group around, you can see that everything inside the group is moving. Now let's align that with the Photoshop logo by the same method. selecting both layers and then going up to our tool options and aligning them horizontally. And I'm going to bring the Learn Photoshop a little bit closer to the logo. That's good, because I have something else that I want to type up top right here. I want to type the word part 1 above the Learn Photoshop, because this is part 1 of our Photoshop series. And what I want to do is I want to space out individual characters, so the space between P and A and R, I want to make that space a bit wider. So what I would do is I would go over to the right hand side on the properties, and where I have tracking right here, you can see this arrow indicates that that's the direction of the space, right? So let's go ahead and open that up some more. And as I click this, pay attention to what happens to the part 1. You see it spreads out wider. But what I want is I want it a bit wider than that. So let's go 600, or maybe come back down 400. That's good. Press enter, and that's good. And I'm going to align it to everything else. The next thing I'll do is I will want to make sure that the space between the part 1 and the Learn Photoshop is the same as the space between the Learn Photoshop and the Photoshop logo. I'm going to manually move it so you get an understanding of how things work. There is a shorter way to doing this, but let's learn the basics. So I brought it down to touch the Learn Photoshop, and now I'm going to move it up by using the arrow keys on my keyboard. But let me show you something. When you move the arrow keys on the keyboard, you see it's moving. But if you hold shift and then use the arrow keys, you can see it jumps up further, right? So let's go back down and let's move it up with shift, and 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 3. Now that looks a little bit more even with the space right here. I can check by going over to my layers, selecting the Photoshop icon, moving it up similarly to what I just did, and then moving down 3 spaces, because that's what we just did with the part 1, right? 1, 2, 3, and there we have it. That is even with the part 1. Now I can select all of these, the part 1, the Learn, the rectangle, and the Photoshop icon, and I can align those so that the centers are aligned. There we have it. And then I can group those now, so when I move one, everything moves. Remember, I already have them selected, so let's go ahead and press Control on my keyboard and then the letter G while I'm holding Control, and you can see a new group that was formed. And if I turn this group off, these eyeballs right here means that you can turn off the visibility of each layer. See? I'm going to select the group. Let's call the group Info. All right. And now we're going to move that group a little bit off the edge of the document right here. It's too close to the edge. Let's move it over some more. That should be good. And let's move it down a little bit. And we're good. But if you can see, the part one is still a little bit hard to read for my liking. So what I would do, I would put another shape behind everything that we have in the info group. So I would go ahead and select the shape tool. Maybe change the color. I want the color to match this blue wall right here. So let's choose that blue. And we're clicking, holding, and dragging our shape. There we go. And then we're moving it behind by going over to layers. We're moving it behind all our info. There we have it. But what I want to do, the vision I have for this is, I don't want the edge of the rectangle to be this sharp so you know that it's a rectangle. So I'm going to select the rectangle. I'm going to add a filter to it so it gets blurred out a little bit. Let's go filter, that's up top right here where you have file, edit, and all those stuff. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and there's a little dialog box that will pop up. You just click convert to smart object, and right here you'll get the blur option box, and when you move this dial you can see that the blur amount that's on the rectangle is being reduced. If I bring it all the way up, you can see it gets blurred out all the way till it's even touching my face. That's not what I want. So maybe let's stick to maybe 120, I think should be good. The next thing is I don't want the blue to be that strong behind everything right here. So we can go ahead and tone that down, make it a bit more transparent by clicking on the layer. It's already selected. And above that, under your layers, you have opacity. And when you slide this opacity slider, you can see that the blue rectangle is becoming more and more transparent. See? So I'm thinking maybe 60%. You can just come in here as well and type an exact number, or just click on your layer and press any number on your number pad, whether 1 will make it 10%, 5 will make it 50%, 6 will make it 60%. And I think that's where we want to have it. So I think that's good. And I think this is where I want the thumbnail to be. I think this is what I want. This is the look I was going for. I don't think I will make any major adjustments to it. Maybe I'll make the word learn Photoshop a bit bigger so that it's easier to read when the thumbnail gets really small on YouTube. But for now, I think this is where we're at. I think this is really good. Something very, very important that we did not do that we should have done. We should have been saving our file as we were designing. Before you start designing, please, and even when you are designing and in the process, please, please, please save your project. Save your project. Save your project. It is an absolute headache if you're designing something and you didn't save it, and then there's a power outage or your computer just shuts off and you didn't save it. That design is gone. And you have to do that all over again. Please save your project. Save your project. Save your project. So it even happens to me. So let's go ahead and save our file. So we're gonna do File, Save, and we're gonna name this LSPV YouTube thumbnail. And then I think this is episode 11. So let's just say episode 11. Say 011, 11. And then, okay. Now that was the Photoshop version. We can't upload the Photoshop version to YouTube or Instagram or wherever we want to put it. So we have to go ahead and save like a JPEG or a PNG. So let's go ahead and save as. And we're just going to click this drop down that says save as type. And then we're going to select JPEG. And then we're going to press save. And then you can choose the quality of your file if you want it not so large. I normally just max it out, and you can see your file size right here. Your file will be 1.1 megabytes. And then okay. And there you have it. I really hope you found value from all that we did today. Let me know if you have Photoshop already, or let me know if you plan to get it and try designing something on your own. You can just snap a photo with your phone, bring it into Photoshop and write something cool on it, and then you can post it online on Instagram or Facebook. I mean, it's that simple, as you just saw. If you're watching this video, I really believe that you're all talented creatives and passionate about Photoshop and graphic designing. And I really think that with practice, you guys can get it done. When you've done designing whatever you thought of, send me an email and let me see what you guys have done. That would be really cool, and I'd love to see what you guys come up with. My email address is listed below. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, my name is CJam, and I will see you guys in the next video.